Just after sunrise on a bitter January morning during the winter of 1988, more than 60 ranchers stood in complete silence outside the Miller Ranch, waiting for the young woman they had laughed at years earlier, and not one of them cared anymore whether the rusty machine she had bought looked worthless, because everything they still hoped to save depended on whether she could make it run one more time. Some stood with snow collecting across their hats, while others wrapped both hands around steaming coffee cups that had long since grown cold because their eyes never left the weathered machine sitting quietly inside the old equipment shed. And among the crowd were men who still remembered the livestock auction where the rancher's granddaughter had spent nearly every dollar she owned buying the one machine nobody else had even bothered to bid on, a decision that had filled the sale barn with laughter, loud enough for people to repeat the story for years afterward. One elderly rancher slowly removed his hat, never taking his eyes off the shed, before quietly saying, "Back then, we thought the old rancher was teaching that girl how to waste money. Turns out he was teaching her how to save the rest of us." Words that disappeared into the cold morning air just as the shed doors slowly began to open. 10 years earlier, before anyone in Ash Creek believed a forgotten machine could one day become the difference between saving a ranch and losing one, there lived an old rancher who believed the greatest investment he would ever make wasn't in cattle, land, or equipment, but in the quiet young granddaughter who followed him everywhere he went. Long before anyone in Ash Creek laughed when Walter Miller's granddaughter bought the rusty machine nobody else wanted, before the winter of 1988 turned that forgotten piece of equipment into the last hope of struggling ranches across the valley, and years before people admitted the old rancher had been right all along, there was something almost everyone who truly knew Walter quietly agreed upon, because he never measured a person's worth by their age, their mistakes, or the opinions other people held about them, believing instead that the greatest things in life often began with someone choosing to believe in you before you had given the world any reason to believe in yourself. Emma had been following her grandfather around the ranch for as long as anyone could remember because, after losing her parents when she was still very young, Walter became far more than the man who raised her, quietly filling the place of father, grandfather, teacher, and closest friend all at once, while she grew into the habit of beginning every morning exactly where she knew she would find him, standing beside the old barn with 2 steaming mugs waiting on the fence post, one for himself and one filled with hot chocolate instead of coffee, because he always insisted there would be plenty of years for coffee after childhood had finished doing its work. Most mornings began before sunrise as they rode horseback together across the ranch, checking fences, looking after cattle, and repairing whatever the previous day's wind had managed to loosen. Yet Walter never hurried those hours because he believed work was simply the excuse life gave people to spend time together, often stopping halfway through a job to admire a newborn calf, finding its feet, or watching the first light settle across the open pasture while Emma filled the silence with endless questions about ranching, weather, old stories, or why certain things were done the way they had always been done. And no matter how busy the day became, he somehow answered every question, as though there were nothing more important in the world than helping one curious little girl understand it. Neighbors often smiled whenever they saw the two of them together, because Emma was rarely more than a few steps behind Walter, proudly carrying tools almost too heavy for her small hands, while refusing every offer of help simply because she wanted to prove she could keep up with her grandfather, causing Walter to laugh softly before quietly taking the heavier end without ever making her feel as though she hadn't been strong enough, a kindness so ordinary that she hardly noticed it then, though years later she would realize he had spent her entire childhood teaching confidence without ever needing to speak the word. One autumn afternoon, while clearing space inside an old machinery shed that hadn't been opened in years, Emma stopped in front of a massive rust-covered machine sitting beneath layers of dust and cobwebs before wrinkling her nose and asking why anyone had kept something that looked too broken to ever work again, causing Walter to gently brush his weathered hand across the faded metal, smile the same quiet smile she knew so well, and softly answer, "Most folks stop looking the moment they see rust," before glancing toward his granddaughter with unmistakable warmth in his eyes and adding, "But the best things I've ever known all needed somebody willing to see a little deeper." Emma looked from her grandfather to the forgotten machine once more, smiled without fully understanding what he meant, and reached for an old rag lying nearby, beginning to wipe years of dust from the faded paint beside him. Because if Walter Miller believed something was still worth caring for, that was all the reason she needed. Walter Miller never cared much for livestock auctions unless he believed there was something worth bringing home, because while most ranchers arrived looking for the newest equipment or the strongest breeding stock, Walter had spent a lifetime quietly searching for things other people had already given up on, often telling Emma that the easiest bargains to find were the ones hidden beneath other people's impatience. A way of looking at life that had puzzled her for years, but never stopped her from following him wherever he went. The annual Ash Creek auction always drew a crowd, filling the sale yard with ranchers swapping stories, teasing old friends, and studying the long rows of machinery waiting to be sold. Yet, while everyone else gathered around newer tractors and polished equipment, Walter wandered toward the far end of the yard, where an old snow crawler sat forgotten beneath rust, faded paint, and years of neglect, causing Emma to wrinkle her nose before quietly asking if it had been left there by mistake, only for Walter to rest his weathered hand against the cold steel and smile with the quiet certainty she had come to recognize whenever he saw something no one else did. The auctioneer eventually reached the old machine almost as an afterthought, joking that they might finally clear enough space to park something useful if anyone was willing to haul the rusty thing away, remarks that filled the sale barn with easy laughter as ranchers shook their heads, looked away, or folded their bidding cards, because nobody wanted to spend good money on a machine everyone believed had already lived its last useful day, while Walter stood silently studying it without saying a word. Emma noticed the hesitation in his eyes before quietly asking whether he still wanted it, and although he admitted he did, he also smiled with the peaceful acceptance of a man who already knew the ranch couldn't spare the money that week, because repairing fences after a difficult season had emptied nearly everything they had saved, leaving Emma to glance down at the small envelope she had carried in her coat pocket containing the money she had spent 3 summers earning through odd jobs around neighboring ranches, savings she had dreamed of using to buy her first horse. Before she had time to second-guess herself, she slowly lifted her bidding card. For a brief moment, the entire sale barn grew strangely quiet as people turned to see who had made the bid. But the silence lasted only seconds before laughter rolled across the crowd, because no one expected a rancher's teenage granddaughter to spend her savings on the one machine every experienced rancher had already decided was worthless, and one man near the front jokingly called out, "Walter, looks like your granddaughter's buying herself the most expensive pile of scrap in the county," causing another wave of laughter to echo through the building, while Emma felt her face grow warm enough that she couldn't bring herself to look at anyone. Walter never looked toward the crowd. He looked only at Emma, then he placed one gentle hand on her shoulder, smiled with unmistakable pride, and softly said, "I've never been prouder of a purchase in my life," words that somehow made the laughter around them feel smaller, because for the first time Emma realized she didn't need an entire room to believe in her. while the one man she trusted most already did. As they slowly drove the old machine home behind the ranch truck that evening, people along the road smiled, waved, and laughed once more at the sight of the rusty equipment rattling toward the Miller ranch. Yet Walter simply glanced across at his granddaughter before resting one hand on the worn steering wheel and quietly saying, "Most folks think they're laughing at an old machine." And after letting the sentence settle between them for a moment, he smiled gently before adding, "They just don't know they're laughing at tomorrow." The old snow crawler arrived at the Miller ranch looking every bit as hopeless as the auction crowd had claimed, because its faded paint had almost disappeared beneath rust. One track refused to move at all, and the engine hadn't been started in so many years that even neighbors passing along the county road slowed down just to shake their heads before smiling at the sight of Walter and Emma happily unloading what everyone else still called the county's most expensive pile of scrap. Yet neither of them seemed bothered, because while other people saw an abandoned machine, Walter somehow still saw work waiting to be finished. Most evenings after the ranch chores were done, they wandered into the old machinery shed together, Walter handing Emma a wrench one moment, explaining an engine part the next, and laughing whenever she accidentally covered herself with grease, gently reminding her that nobody ever learned to fix anything without first getting their hands dirty. Lessons that slowly became less about machinery and more about patience, because every bolt that refused to loosen and every broken part that needed replacing quietly taught her that worthwhile things rarely came back to life all at once. The laughter around town never completely disappeared, because whenever neighbors stopped by the ranch, they usually found the same two people still working on the old machine, leading more than one rancher to jokingly ask whether they planned to finish restoring it before the next century, remarks that always made Emma smile politely, even though they stung a little more than she admitted, while Walter simply thanked them for visiting before returning to work, as though other people's opinions had never been heavy enough to slow his hands. One cool autumn morning, and as they paused for coffee beside the machine they had spent months restoring together, Walter rested his hand on the weathered metal and quietly said, "Emma, one day people will tell you to give up on things they never truly understood, and when that day comes, don't let their certainty become louder than your own conviction." Words she nodded at without realizing how soon she would need them, because only a few weeks later Walter's health began failing, forcing him to spend more time resting on the porch than walking the ranch he had loved for nearly all his life. The machine remained unfinished when Walter gently called Emma to sit beside him one evening as the sun disappeared beyond the pasture, and after they spent several quiet minutes watching the cattle drift toward the barn, he reached across, took her hand, and softly said, "Promise me you'll finish what we started," causing tears to gather in her eyes as she squeezed his weathered hand and whispered, "I promise, Grandpa." A promise Walter answered with one peaceful smile before turning his eyes back toward the ranch, content that the future he cared about most had never really been the machine waiting inside the shed. A few days later, Ash Creek gathered to say goodbye to Walter Miller, and after the last truck disappeared down the dusty road, Emma found herself standing alone inside the machinery shed, with one hand resting against the cold steel they had worked on together, quietly wiping away a tear before picking up the same wrench her grandfather had used only weeks earlier, because grief had taken the man she loved most, but it hadn't taken the promise she intended to keep. The first year without Walter felt longer than every year before it, because the Miller ranch had grown strangely quiet. The porch held only one steaming mug each morning, and the old machinery shed echoed with sounds that once belonged to two people instead of one. Yet every evening after the ranch work was finished, Emma unlocked the weathered doors, switched on the single hanging light, and quietly continued restoring the old snow crawler exactly as she had promised, discovering that keeping a promise to someone you loved often meant showing up on the days you wanted to quit the most. The people of Ash Creek never stopped noticing because whenever neighbors drove past the ranch and spotted the shed lights glowing after sunset, someone usually found a reason to smile and joke that Walter's granddaughter was still chasing the same impossible dream, while more than one rancher stopped by offering to buy the machine for scrap, kindly explaining that the money would serve her far better than a pile of rust that would never earn its keep. Advice offered with good intentions, but accepted only with a grateful smile and the same quiet answer every time. "I'm going to finish it first." Months slowly became years, and little by little the forgotten machine began looking less like something rescued from a scrapyard and more like something waiting patiently for another chance, because every repaired track, rebuilt gear, and newly fitted engine part carried not only Emma's hard work, but also memories of Walter's patient voice, reminding her that worthwhile things rarely returned to life overnight, leaving her to realize that she wasn't simply rebuilding a machine anymore. She was becoming the kind of person her grandfather had always believed she could be. Then came the autumn of 1988, when the first weather reports began warning of an unusually harsh winter moving toward the valley, causing most ranchers to service their tractors, stock extra feed, and confidently assure one another they had weathered difficult winters before, while Emma quietly walked into the machinery shed, rested her hand on the old snow crawler, and after several moments of thoughtful silence, climbed into the driver's seat, turned the key, and listened as the engine came to life with a deep, steady rumble that filled the little shed for the very first time, bringing an unexpected smile to her face, because although she had just started a machine, what she truly felt was the quiet fulfillment of a promise made on a peaceful autumn evening years before. Outside, the first snowflake of the season drifted silently onto the ranch. Winter arrived with a force no one in Ash Creek had expected, because within a single week, snow-buried fence lines, icy winds drifted across the open range, and temperatures fell so quickly that machinery, which had worked faithfully for years, suddenly refused to start, leaving ranchers stranded with cattle trapped beneath deep snow and feed supplies lying just beyond roads that had become impossible to cross, while every passing hour threatened losses no family could afford. At first, everyone believed the storm would pass within a day or two, but when another wave of snow settled across the valley and modern equipment continued breaking down one machine after another, confidence slowly gave way to worry until the same ranchers who had spent years trusting newer equipment found themselves standing helplessly in frozen yards, watching hungry cattle disappear beneath blowing snow while wondering what else they could possibly try. Late that afternoon, the sound of tires crunching across the Miller Ranch broke the silence as an aging pickup slowly stopped outside Emma's gate, and when she stepped onto the porch, she immediately recognized Mr. Dawson, the rancher whose laughter had echoed loudest through the auction barn the day she bought the old machine, though there was nothing amusing about his face now, because he removed his hat, looked down at the snow beneath his boots, and quietly admitted, "Emma, I've got cattle that won't make another night unless somebody can reach them, and I don't have anything left that will." For a brief moment she looked past him toward the weathered machine resting inside the shed, remembering the laughter, the whispers, and every offer to sell it for scrap. Yet even more clearly she remembered Walter's steady voice, reminding her that people often judged things long before they understood them, and without mentioning the past or asking for an apology, she simply nodded, pulled on her coat, and softly said, "Let's go save your cattle." The old machine rumbled to life with the same deep, steady sound she had heard only days before, pushing through snow that swallowed the tracks of every vehicle which had tried before it. And by nightfall one stranded herd had been reached, then another, and before sunrise word had spread across Ash Creek that Walter Miller's forgotten machine was crossing places nothing else could, causing pickup after pickup to begin turning toward the Miller Ranch until a long line quietly formed outside the gate. Not with laughter this time, but with anxious families hoping the granddaughter everyone had underestimated might still have enough time to help them too. As Emma climbed down from the machine after returning from another rescue, she looked across the waiting line of ranchers standing silently in the falling snow and noticed something that would have meant everything to Walter, because no one was pointing, no one was smiling, and no one was laughing anymore. Instead, they stood patiently with hats in their hands, waiting for the young woman they had once doubted, while one older rancher slowly shook his head and softly whispered, "Your grandpa wasn't fixing a machine. He was protecting all of us." The storms finally loosened their grip on Ash Creek a few weeks later as warmer days began softening the heavy snow that had buried the valley for so long, leaving ranchers to count the cattle they had saved instead of the ones they had feared losing. And although life slowly returned to its familiar rhythm, one thing never returned to the way it had been before, because every person who had stood in line outside the Miller Ranch carried home far more than water, feed, or rescued livestock, taking with them a quiet respect for an old rancher whose wisdom they had understood only after they needed it most. The old snow crawler remained exactly where it had always belonged inside the machinery shed, its faded paint still worn, its steel still carrying the scars of countless winters, and despite more than one collector offering Emma generous sums to buy it after word of the winter of 1988 spread beyond Ash Creek, she thanked every one of them before gently refusing, because some things become too valuable to measure by money once they begin carrying the memory of someone you love. One bright Saturday morning the following spring, as Emma wiped dust from the old machine before putting away her tools, she heard footsteps behind her and turned to find a young ranch boy standing quietly inside the shed, his eyes fixed on the weathered crawler before he finally asked, "Miss Emma, if the winter's over now, why do you still take care of it?" Causing her to smile as she rested one hand on the cold steel exactly where Walter's hand had rested so many years before, closing her eyes for just a moment as though she could almost hear his voice filling the quiet shed once again. When she looked back at the little boy, her smile had grown warmer, because she realized she was hearing the very same question she had asked her grandfather years earlier, and after a gentle pause, she softly answered, "Because the day people need something isn't the day you should start getting it ready," before looking toward the open ranch gate, where neighbors now stopped not to laugh, but simply to wave, adding with quiet gratitude, "My grandpa thought he was teaching me how to restore an old machine, but he was really teaching me how to prepare for people who hadn't even realized they would need me one day." The little boy stood quietly for several moments before reaching down to pick up an old wrench lying beside the machine, carefully placing it back where it belonged without anyone asking him to. A small gesture that made Emma smile, because in that ordinary moment she suddenly understood what Walter had seen all those years ago, that the greatest things we leave behind are rarely the land we own, the cattle we raise, or even the machines we restore. They are the people who quietly become better because we believed in them first. Looking back now, many still tell the story of the winter of 1988 as the year an old machine saved ranches across Ash Creek, but those who truly knew Walter Miller tell it differently, because they understand the machine was never the miracle. The miracle was an old rancher who looked at a little girl long before the rest of the world did and saw the woman she would one day become, and perhaps that's why no one in Ash Creek ever laughed at the old snow crawler again, not because they had learned to respect an aging machine, but because every time they looked at it, they remembered the quiet truth Walter had spent a lifetime proving. Sometimes the things the world calls worthless are simply waiting for someone willing to believe in them. If this story reminded you of someone who believed in you before you believed in yourself, we'd love to hear about them in the comments, because people like Walter rarely realize how deeply they shape the lives around them. And if you'd like to join us for more stories about ordinary people whose quiet faith changed generations, consider subscribing to The Last Acre, where every acre holds a story, every season leaves a lesson, and the greatest harvests are often the ones that grow inside people. Thank you for spending part of your day with us. We'll see you in the next story.